So let's get into it. I'm not going to spend too much time describing myself, just merely to say that I am a clinical psychologist by training, worked a lot for a long time in the police, dealing with concerning behavior of violent nature and sexually violent nature. And as time went by, I got more and more exposed to the threat assessment side of things. How do we prevent violence from actually happening? How do we pick it up as early as possible that there is a concern, intervene, and divert that concern from actually realizing? And that's what I found far more rewarding than a lot of the work in the police, which was responding to something that already happened. So I ended up joining the European Threat Association. Of course, in 2019, as I said, we started the African Association. And really for the past, since 2016, I would say, have just focused on threatening behavior, typically in the workplace, but also the education context and other contexts. So I think many of us in South Africa, at least, have seen headlines like these over the years, and we often forget them. You know, we hear about a shooting like the one we had, what was it now, almost 2 weeks ago at the school. But there's been lots of these types of incidences, whether it's a teacher murdered by a pupil at her home, or on the left-hand side, cop shoots wife in full view, or Soweto teacher claims principal assaulted them. And of course, in the middle of the screen here, we have one of the most well-known cases in South Africa of the young boy, Morne Harms, 2008, who took swords to school one day and killed one and injured three. And we're going to quickly touch on that case in a moment as an example of the types of things that we get in South Africa. This isn't just a foreign problem. This is definitely a South African problem. And I think the fact that we had over 300 people sign up for this webinar, the most we've ever had, shows that this is a concern that people are struggling to really deal with. But again, as of about 2 days ago, this was circulated by the Hyde Park High School. It's a media release. It's a high school here in Johannesburg, where one of their teachers committed suicide in the classroom, allegedly. So again, this is not something that just affects scholars. It's about also self-directed violence and how can we prevent that from taking place as far as we can. So I'm going to show you a short video. It's about 5 minutes, but it's some of the responses to the recent shooting at Primrose School. And listen, I want you to listen to what people are saying, and I'm going to ask you at the end of it, what do you think is the most important? It's about 5 minutes, so it's a bit of a montage, so I've edited a few news reports together, and these are the dominant themes that were coming out from this particular scenario, and I hope that you can all hear this video. There's no
sound. The learner who got the Primrose Primary School principal on Friday has left shock and trauma in the corridors of the school. The provincial education and received Matoma Chilwan had been established. The learner was targeting 3 teachers on that day, Chilwana and other government officials visited the school to discuss how to beef up security there.
The people who targeted the first teacher, the deputy principal, and the principal according to the child. So these are the 3 people who are giving them problems in school because they are notifying the parents.
The school was already concerned about the 13-year-old before the incident.
They had meetings before. They had meetings last month with the parents of the child. They said, but the child, homework, they are following down the schoolwork, the child is not performing, and these are the challenges. So apparently, the child gets home, the parent panics them. I don't know specifics of that kind of punishment. I we can assume perhaps maybe there's a bit of abuse that's taking place. Nobody could have suspected a shooting. I don't think anyone could have. I've never experienced. I mean, I've been in MEC for over a year. I've served in the legislature in the portfolio committee for many more years. We've never experienced a shooting where an educator gets shot by a learner, especially in the primary school. It's an incident that is unexpected for all of us.
From my side of the council, I want to ensure that no one is carrying weapons, be it a child, be it an adult, or even be it an educator, that it is safe when you enter here. The department, the spokesperson, Steve Mabona, also urged that parents need to help their children with conflict management.
If we own firearms, we should be having, if it's licensed, because we understand that this firearm belongs to a parent. So we need to be wary of exposing, firearms like that, and also instill discipline. in our children. Our children need to know when they go to school, what is it that they're going to do there? You can't, even if you have an issue with an educator or a principal or anyone in the school, you can't resort to harming anyone or even think about harming anyone.
Let's now speak to the Deputy Chairperson at the Foundation for Education and Social Justice Africa, Hendrik Makanija, about the safety and security in schools.
And I think that the department is correct to say that discipline starts at home. If parents cannot instill discipline at home, it will be difficult for teachers at school level, to win this battle of, discipline amongst learners if the same is not enforced at home.
The question then is for me is that, did he come with the firearm to the school in the morning, so the firearm was somewhere in his bag and carried it along with him in the school? Is this the first time that he's doing something like this? How has this been allowed to happen in the school? What is it about the nature of the society in Congo?
Well, to be quite honest with you, the hands of teachers are often tied when it comes to, searching learners. For example, teachers do not have that power, to search the learners in terms of the law. The limitation of rights is there. If a learner disrupts or puts the lives of other learners in danger, teachers do have that power to take the learner out of the classroom. And of course, even if a learner has got a dangerous weapon, that poses a risk, to learners and teachers. Yeah. Again, teachers have a right to take such a learner out of the school premises.
Do you think that reinstituting corporal punishment will actually become a form of making sure that the schools become much safer?
To be quite honest with you, that is also a debatable matter which parents should actively engage in. What I can say is that when corporal punishment was abolished back in the 90s, there was a view that if you beat the learner, that is violence, and that if you are violent towards a learner in terms of this corporal punishment, it means will produce a violent society. Yeah. Learners will in turn become violent.
It's quite sad what happened at our environment. We wish to call upon parents to work with us and make sure that we instill discipline in our children. And we're going to take necessary action against this learner.
What do you want the MEC to do?
I think the MEC must support us with the security to make sure that early in the morning and during the teaching, they must move around the school and then search those who are coming up with the illegal stuff. That's what we are going to speak to the MEC. And so far, when they are busy in class for learning and teaching, and then they must walk around and then chase those who are not in class for no reasons.
So, let's get my camera going here. Sorry. A minute. There we go. So the dominant theme of what we've been hearing, if you listen to this, is essentially that conflict management, you got to teach people conflict management skills. It's a problem about discipline. It's a problem of security. We need more security guards. We need armed guards, some people calling for. And it's about punishment. This person needs to be severely punished. None of this is going to help you prevent this or deal with this particular issue. But this seems to be the stock standard kind of response from our government, from our education department, from parents. None of this is going to work. And I'm going to explain to you why, and then I'm going to explain what actually we need to be doing. And again, it comes back to that old saying, if it's supposed it's tempting if the only tool you have is a hammer is to treat everything as if it were a nail. So what is the most important thing that you actually heard out of all those conversations? Perhaps just think about that. And what was your reaction? Were you nodding your head as these people were going on about more discipline and security and searching students? For me, the most important thing that was said out of all these conversations was the fact, and you see the underlined portion on the right-hand side, that the child had been planning for this for quite a while. People were targeted, etc. So this isn't something that nobody knew about. That's the most important thing. We see this also, other headlines. Shooting was planned for a while. He planned to kill the deputy principal also and his class teacher. Everything he communicated was via WhatsApp groups to pupils that were being created, etc. We also saw the MEC for Education said, the pupil had taken bullets to school on a previous occasion. Well, how does he know that? Unless someone had seen this on a previous occasion. They didn't necessarily tell the right people. But what we see very often in these sort of targeted violence scenarios is that people know about this. And we'll get into the reasons why people don't come forward with that information in a moment. But if anything, this kid had behavioral problems prior to him engaging in some threatening or potentially threatening behavior. I mean, he was known to be struggling in school. They'd called the parents in, etc. So this starts off with a kid who's not doing well, who's got some issues in the school context. Of course, not everybody that has those problems are going to end up doing something harmful. Of course not. But this is where it does start. And even if this kid doesn't end up doing something harmful, surely that's a kid that actually needs to have some attention and assistance to sort out what they are dealing with. Now, the question, like you said, we saw a lot about security. Why isn't security the solution? I keep on repeating over and over and over. And just off the top of your head, because I didn't know this figure until I Googled it, how many schools do you think there are in South Africa? Because according to the internet, there's almost 25,000 schools in South Africa. And I'm going to show you another short video. This was from 2021. Remember, this is now 2024, we are. And the first part is quite surprising because they speak about multiple principals having been shot at school or killed at school. But the second part is basically why financially we are never going to be able to afford security. It's a very short video.
There's a third case that I'm attending to in this area alone, where principals are targeted and killed, to be quite sure. The reason being, we can't afford armed guards. We can't afford professional guards with the budget that we have as an education sector. So we had to revert to volunteers. We have to revert to our general assistants to play that role. So we want security guards in our schools, but we don't have the financial muscle to hire them. We want people that can protect all of us, but we don't have the financial muscle to do that.
So think about it. If you properly want to secure a school with security, you'd literally need to have airport level security. That every time a person sets foot on a school, whether it's a teacher who teaches there, a scholar who goes there, a parent, parents, visiting scholars for sports events, staff, groundsmen, kitchen staff, cleaners, every time somebody steps foot on that property, you'd have to put them through a metal detector and screen their bags. All deliveries that are made for stationery and all other types of things that are delivered would have to individually be screened and checked. It's impossible. It's impossible to do that. It would disrupt the school day. It would cost an absolute fortune to try and do that. And you'd have to do this all the time. You couldn't just do this once a day. You couldn't just do this for new people entering the premises because, as we saw with the recent shooting, this was a kid who belonged in the school. He had every right to be there every single day. You'd literally have to have prison-like walls 10-meter high to prevent someone from throwing something over the wall and then retrieving it later on in the school. So security is never going to be the solution because our schools will become airport prisons, literally, and there's just not the financial ability to employ 24-hour guard staff to patrol the walls, secure everybody coming in and out of that school. It's impossible. But also, similarly, what about hockey sticks? What about cricket bats? What about garden tools? What about broken glass from a window? What about a brick? What about a chair? What about your fists? What about your feet? Because all of these are weapons at some point or can be used as weapons. So to focus on the weapon is really just missing the point. I'm not saying we shouldn't take steps to try and see what we can do about weapons being brought onto schools. Of course not. But that is not going to solve your problem. It's about an angry person who's gotten to that particular point in their emotional state where they want to commit harm to people. So focusing on the weapon, you're actually misleading people to what the solution is going to be. The threat is inside your school with permission to be there because it's a scholar, it's a teacher, it's a staff member, it's an admin staff member. And the person planning a targeted attack like we saw at Primrose School, he's not trying to shoot the principal in secret and get away with it. He doesn't care about the outcome. So a motivated person who's going to a place like a school to commit a violent act of this nature, he doesn't care that you've got a security guard standing at the front door searching him. He's going to shoot the security guard and go inside and do whatever he wants to. So again, security often just becomes the point at which the violence starts in these types of criminals. So how does this compare? I mean, many of you might remember back in 2008 at the Nick Deirdrick School in Krugersdorp. It's a high school where a young matric final year student went to school in the morning on a Monday with a couple of swords and knives, donned a homemade slip knot mask, put on elbow pads, knee pads, painted his face, and proceeded to kill one student with his sword, injure 2 groundspeople, and injure another student. This was our first attempt at a mass school murder in South Africa. And this Primrose case was actually the second. So essentially, if we look at that kid's background, like many kids, he felt rejected by his parents. There was issues of family violence. He had these fantasies about attacking terrorists and blowing up a mass of people. But again, these aren't per se indicators that you're going to have someone committing a violent act. He wanted to become a soldier. He'd stolen, arbitrary items from friends' homes. He did have a very small, light substance abuse history. So already we have a kid who's obviously struggling with something. But let's look at his school performance in the years leading up to Morné Harmse committing his violent act in 2008. Well, what we see is from 2004 to 2008, his school average was deteriorating significantly. Of course, this was picked up by the school. They did try to intervene. And if you speak to his teachers, they said, look, he didn't really have any indications that he was being bullied. He had a friendship crowd. He wasn't one of these severely isolated loner types. He attended class. He didn't ditch school and not pitch up, etc. He was reported to be very quiet in class, kind of kid who wouldn't participate unless you kind of asked him to a direct question. No significant disciplinary issues with this kid in the school environment. He did have a very, very negative view about his future after school. What am I going to be doing? What future do I have, etc. And the Wednesday and Thursday before the incident, which took place the following Monday, a teacher had called him in because she'd noticed in an essay that he had written that he had this very, very despondent idea about his future. But let's look more specifically at things that really are very obvious warning signs, because all of the stuff I've discussed until now, can mean a lot of things, and very rarely isn't going to mean that someone's going to commit a violent act. So you can say, well, maybe we can forgive the people for not really reacting extremely to those concerns about his, behavior and fear of the concerns for the future. But let's look a bit close to the actual incident. And I'm going to work back from the incident itself. 3 days before, on the Friday before that incident took place, he had discussed with his friendship group how he and they should come to school on Monday and kill people. And they discussed amongst themselves who's going to use what method. So one kid said he's going to bring a homemade bomb. Another kid said he's going to bring his father's firearm. Another kid said he'll borrow one of Morné's swords. The only problem is the others were joking. Morné wasn't joking. So fortunately on that Monday, Morné was the only person who actually took any steps towards putting that plan into action. But we have people having conversations that really should have been brought to the attention at least of a teacher. A week before the incident, he made the slipknot type of masks that he wore on the incident. A week before, he sends text messages to people saying, I'm stressed out and I've been very hurt in my life. People are going to pay. Something big is going to happen just at school. Wait and see. And again, these are almost eerily similar to what we see in a lot of the US-based kinds of shootings where all this information comes out after the incident. 2 weeks before, we see a change in the behavior. He started to spend more time in his room. He's cleaning his swords. And, his room, the state of his room was kind of deteriorating. So again, a lot of things that almost mirror what we had here in this Primrose incident. In the previous year, a person said in one of her affidavits, Morné would regularly speak to me about killing people at school. I thought he was joking. This term or semester, he spoke about it a lot, but he didn't say why he wanted to do it. So again, the question is, but why didn't this person tell somebody? 2 years before the incident, the swords were purchased. And all this kind of information about where he's telling people is what we refer to as leakage. And as I said, is documented in so many of these overseas cases. But now we have it here in this case in 2008. And of course, the recent Primrose case, exactly the same kind of behavior appearing before the incident actually takes place. So moving aside from that, and this is more going into the theory of how do we approach dealing with these particular issues. This is kind of a nice saying that we often have, that not all threats are equal, but all threats must be assessed. So we don't know when a kid says, I could just bring a gun to school and shoot someone. Just based on that statement, we don't know if he's kidding or not. The only way we're going to know whether we have to worry is if we start to do some level of inquiry, some level of an investigation. Just pull the kid aside and say, what did you mean by that? Speak to a teacher. How's he been doing in school? Find out, does he have friends? Is he very isolated? What's he posting on social media? It's only when we've done a very basic threat assessment can we actually say that, that's a joke, it's a bad joke, and we need to speak to this kid about that's not a very cool thing to say, or actually we have a bigger concern and how we're going to actually intervene in dealing with that particular problem. We also say that a school is a workplace. And it's a business. Unlike other businesses where your customer comes and briefly interacts with you and goes, in the education environment, your customers or your clients are the students. And they spend a large portion of their day, in fact, their lives, with you at that school. So the same issues that we see in other environments, problematic behavior between people, is going to play out in the school. But also we have relationships that form and end in the school contexts. There's pressure to perform, pressure to do well enough to get into university, etc. And we're just not going to like everybody. We're not going to like all our teachers. Our teachers are not going to like all the students, and the students aren't going to like each other, and teachers are not going to all like each other. Those are things you can expect in any organization or anytime you have a group of people. Also, we kind of define education violence. And again, South Africa, because we are quite a violent society, we tend to think in South Africa that violence means somebody's bleeding somewhere. But really, the term violence is quite encompassing. We talk about abuse of a person, threats made towards a person is verbal violence, intimidation, assaulting someone, and of course, yes, in the extreme scenarios, killing someone, but in relation to the education context when it comes to education violence. So the types of things we see are threats from strangers, so people who have no association with the school, threats from co-workers, threats from students or teachers, from ex-romantic partners. We've seen quite a lot of cases of the ex-partner going to school and shooting their teacher, their ex-partner who's a teacher at the school. And of course, threats from parents because they're unhappy about their child not being selected for a particular team, or they're unhappy about how a teacher has treated their child, etc. So some examples that we often see with things like, current former student, staff, or service providers sexually harassing a student or staff, a verbalized threat, a physical assault, and an actual sexual assault, a suicide like we saw now at Hyde Park High School in Johannesburg on campus, or if it's a boarding school at the boarding house. Someone stalks a staff member or student anonymously or openly. Bullying falls under this bigger definition. So your approach to dealing with these things, you don't have to have a sexual harassment approach, a bullying approach, this approach. Your approach to dealing with problematic behavior actually encompasses all of these types of issues. Some more examples would be, an ex-boyfriend, like I said, is quite a common thing. What happens if a student submits an essay for his English or whatever language, and the theme is about a kid who's always been bullied, and how this kid takes revenge against the school by poisoning a birthday cake he brings to school. Or someone brings cupcakes to school and gives them to his classmates, and afterwards tells them that he's put poison inside of it. And then a few minutes later, after seeing them panic, just says he's joking. A student who comes to a Halloween social, and when they ask him what's he dressed up as, he says, well, I'm dressed up as a school shooter. Is that just a bad joke, or is it something more concerning? And the reality is, unless we look into it, we're not going to actually know. We should never be assuming that it probably means nothing. Stranger, like I said, sends harassing emails to the headmaster due to their hair policy in the school. We've seen that people get very worked up in South Africa about the issue of hair. Parents making veiled threats to a teacher about behavior of the teacher, or a student tags social media posts by an extremist group, or violent offenders saying, I really understand this guy, or I really feel like this guy. That should also be something that needs to be looked at, and hopefully it's nothing. We don't want things to be problems, but the things we don't know until we look at it. And unless you've actually done a survey of your students and staff, you actually don't have an idea of what's going on, that a lot of these things might be being experienced by your students. And it'll be quite interesting to take the list that I've just been through. And if you're an educator, tomorrow at school, say, have any of you experienced any of these things? Raise your hand. And you'll probably be quite surprised at what doesn't come to the authorities, meaning yourselves, attention in a school place. So if you think you don't have a problem, then you actually just have a reporting problem, because these things statistically will be occurring in your school. Doesn't matter whether you're a faith-based school or not, they will be happening because people are populating your school, students and staff. And if you expect the police to be your solution to their problem, you are dreadfully naive for a lot of reasons. This is not the kind of problem that the police are going to be able to solve from a prevention point of view. So interesting things, though, in terms of assessment in the school context, that the majority of threats tend to be made by students and not adults like teachers or staff. The students, as you would know, are developmentally immature. They have wide domains involving social competence, reasoning, judgment, but also are very receptive to intervention, and often react emotionally and say things that don't necessarily have the meaning behind them or the intention behind them. But we cannot assume that, because if you assume that the previous 20 students didn't do anything when they said such a comment, doesn't mean that 21 isn't going to do something. So any kind of threat assessment in the education context has to take into account the developmental level of the people that you're working with. And secondly, that educators are in a very interesting position, because you have this mission to help students learn and develop. You can't fire a student. I mean, you can expel them, but that's usually quite a process. You have this commitment to giving all people in your classroom an education. And expelling someone is also very short-sighted, because it kicks the kid out the school, but it doesn't remove the problem for your school. Because we have many instances when people go back after being expelled or suspended, or even just after finishing at that particular school and going back and doing something harmful back at the school. So that's why we typically say in organizations, if you fire someone, doesn't mean your problem is gone. It actually just means you don't know what your problem is up to, because you have no contact or interaction with that person. So that's just important to keep in mind, that getting someone out of the school isn't necessarily going to get the problem out of the school. And again, you've got the intertwined goals of preventing violence, but also guiding students to become well-adjusted people and, of course, successful in society. So just briefly, some facts and myths. People think it won't happen here. I can guarantee you the people at Primrose School thought that would never happen here. I mean, in some of these other videos, and unfortunately I had to edit them for time, people said, no, I never thought this would happen in this school. Why would this happen in any school in South Africa? And people often think that school violence is about murder and mass murder. So obviously the Primrose case recently has kicked off a huge discussion. And for that, we're, in a way, that's the good side of it, is that we're getting people to come to a webinar. We've got a whole bunch of people sitting here listening to this. People want to talk about this topic. And that's really, really amazing. And sadly, though, it's as a result of this tragic incident. But the majority of what's happening in the schools in terms of education violence is sublethal. It's the threats, it's the harassment, it's the bullying, and maybe a bit of pushing, shoving, and assault. But to say, well, we don't have these murders very often, therefore this isn't a problem, is also a mindset you have to change. Also, it's always unhappy students. Yes, like we see with the Krugersdorp example in the Primrose, they did appear to be happy students, but you cannot assume it's always going to be that kid who's not happy with his school context. Another myth, and we saw this repeatedly with our Primrose case recently, when they say people just snap. And as we saw, this guy didn't snap. He had been warning people about this for quite a while. Nobody wakes up one morning and just suddenly decides to take a gun to school and shoot someone. There's always a history. And sadly, that history tends to come out after the incident. There's also this myth that you're either dangerous or you're not. You're either a bad person or you're not. I can guarantee you, all of us in the right context with the right stressors can act out violently. It might be more of an emotional type of violence in the heat of the moment, or it could be a more planned type of violence. Everybody's capable of violence, depending on your circumstances. There's other myth, you can't predict this. Well, as we've seen by the Krugersdorp example and the Primrose example, yeah, you can actually predict this, because this kid was telling people who's going to do it, not even ambiguously telling people. He told people exactly what he's going to do. So yeah, actually you can predict a lot of this, because targeted violence always has a process that leads up to it. And the other myth as well, how can you do something about this? Definitely you don't want that kind of person on your team, because it is clearly, as you'll see in the next coming slides, you can do things about this actually. Okay, so other myths on the right-hand side. So how do organizations usually respond? And this cuts across the board from corporates to small businesses to education environments. We don't deal with this issue very well. In fact, we're usually caught sleeping prior to these things taking place. So the typical response that I see across any kind of organization is, well, we're going to react when something bad happens. If a student swears at a teacher, we're going to have a disciplinary hearing. Or in the more extreme cases, we're going to take legal steps. We're going to open up a criminal case if the behavior constitutes a criminal act, or we're going to get a protection order, a restraining order, or we're going to expel the bad person because we have a zero tolerance. As you'll see in a moment, zero tolerance is the worst attitude to have for preventing violence. Or we refer the person to counseling services, employee health and wellness, or whatever counseling services you have. And we think, there you go, problem's taken care of, that person will deal with it, and we'll hear if there are any things that we need to follow up on. That's, again, the worst thing you can do if you just do that. And often what we find is there's only some activity or action late into this whole pathway towards the act occurring, not earlier when we could have prevented it. So each decision you take whenever you're dealing with threatening, concerning behavior is you have to consider, will this raise the level of danger or lower it? So for example, if you speak to any woman who's been in a domestic violence situation and you say to them, have you taken out a protection order, opened up a criminal case? They'll very often say no. And if you say why, they'll say to you, because if I do that, he'll kill me. So domestic violence victims get this very well. But we seem to often not understand why somebody doesn't want to go and take out a protection order for some bad behavior that someone's done, exhibited towards them, or open up a criminal case. So the types of steps, and that includes disciplinary hearing. I've never met anybody who was happy when they heard there's a disciplinary hearing against them. So that step can actually be a danger increasing step. Now, that's not to say that we don't take those steps, but we have to understand that's got nothing to do with keeping you safe. I spoke about zero tolerance a moment ago, and we often hear this. We have a zero tolerance for sexual harassment. We have a zero tolerance for bullying, a zero tolerance for any criminal behavior in this organization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is zero tolerance is usually accompanied by extreme response. So if you even slightly bully someone, you're going to have a huge disciplinary reaction. You could get fired in extreme cases, or you could have some kind of sanction against you. You could have your pay docked. There's usually quite severe responses. Problem with that is people are hesitant to report things because they might be wrong and they don't want to see, harsh consequences. People also think if I tell somebody something, what's going to happen to me? The person's going to get angry at me because that information came out. So I agree 100%. We should have a zero tolerance for doing nothing when we hear problematic behavior. But zero tolerance linked to extreme responses from a punitive point of view, you're not doing yourself a justice, or the people in your company. It's proven to be ineffective in practice, harmful to students. And like I said a moment ago, because what happens is stuff starts to bubble up. There's bad behavior taking place, for example. The kids don't want to report it at that point because what if I'm wrong? I don't want this guy to get into trouble because I'll get into trouble. May he'll be angry with me. So they leave it until it reaches a crisis point. And then they come forward and say, because they feel like they've got 100% reason to come forward now. And when you speak to them, you find out there's this long-standing history that you could have intervened 20 steps previously. So research has shown that things like suspension and expulsion are very ineffective disciplinary practices that don't foster improved student behavior actually. But it sounds good, doesn't it? It sounds great to say we have a zero tolerance and we're going to come down on you like a ton of bricks. Like we heard in the beginning of this presentation, that one person speaking, I think it was the MEC, said we're going to have harsh discipline against this kid. Again, that's not going to stop these kind of kids who have this targeted grievance against someone from doing something. I can guarantee you that. Okay, so we want to be, now there's an expression called left of bang, and it's a book by these two authors. Left of bang means the bang is the incident that's taken place, whether it's a violent act or someone committing suicide or screaming and shouting, whatever the bad event is. If you're only reacting to it, if you're right of bang, it means you're just reactive. You want to be left of bang, which is preventative in nature. So essentially, as I see, point one, the bang is the bad behavior. Let's say it's an assault upon a teacher. We want to be on the left-hand side as early as possible, preparing, preventing, while problems are percolating. We want to try and pick the issues up when they're small and tiny, before we're talking about disciplinary issues. When we notice a kid is displaying concerning behavior in terms of his performance at school, his social interactions, his attitudes towards people. We want to intervene then, not after on the right-hand side where you see the red steps, 2, 3, 4, 5, because that's responding. The bad things happened. We're trying to recover now. We're kind of review what went wrong and then refine our processes. We want to be on the left. So we're kind of good, sort of, on the right-hand side. Police respond. You'll always hear the education department speaking about the psychosocial team is going out to the school. Well, imagine if we didn't need to even have the psychosocial team coming out because we prevented that incident from happening. So response, yes, but we definitely want to be focusing more on prevention. So just the nature of threats, though, is another thing, because a lot of people don't see a threat for what it is. And we can have, threats are easy when someone directly says, I'm going to punch you, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to do some harm to you. I mean, that's clear and straightforward and direct. But you get kind of indirect threats. You have veiled threats like, don't come to school on Monday if you want to live. Or on Monday, you're going to see what's going to happen. Or conditional threats. If I don't get in the first team for rugby, there's going to be hell to pay. But what about something like this? This was somebody's WhatsApp profile picture. And one of the employees went to their colleague and said, look here, what I've seen on John's WhatsApp profile, it just changed to this. Now, some people said, well, it's just a picture, it doesn't mean anything. Maybe it's his own licensed firearm that he's legally entitled to. But you can excuse away any behavior if you want to. But a few questions turns out that John had been dismissed from the company earlier that day. John doesn't own a firearm. So either he's managed to get one illegally, or it would be illegal if he doesn't own the firearm in South African law. John was dismissed earlier that day, so we know he's had a huge negative event taking place. And that envelope that he's pointing his firearm at is his dismissal papers from the company that he was, up until today, working at. Now, that context and information colors in that maybe ambiguous kind of threat, etc. So that's, again, threats can not always be obvious, but at least can you pick it up as a possible threat? And then we explore it to confirm or refute whether it is actually something we need to worry about. And people often say, well, you know what, he hasn't done anything yet. Well, if you want to wait until people do something, then you're right of bang, not left of bang. And of course, threats fluctuate. You can have a person who's incredibly angry today and threatening, but tomorrow his problem's resolved, his relationship is going well, he's no longer angry. But fast forward 6 months, he's got another problem with the company, the bank, or whoever it is that gave him the previous problem. So threats fluctuate. So a person who's low risk when we go and do an assessment could develop into high risk 3 months down the line. Because why? Because people change. His mental health changes. He might be using substances when he wasn't a couple months ago. He might have physical health problems, which also is a risk factor for threatening behavior. His circumstances change. Someone lost their job. The parents lost their jobs. The kid's expelled. He's had relationship problems in school. Maybe he had a very messy breakup with the girl at school. It's very embarrassing. She's now dating his best friend. All these things can cause someone from being low risk to becoming high risk, but also the vice versa. If the mental health problem gets resolved, if the substances get sorted out, his physical health improves, he gets into a new relationship with someone else that he finds to be a rewarding relationship. So for those of you in the threat assessment world, forgive me because you will know this particular diagram very well, but I'm assuming we have a lot of people here today whose experience is not very familiar with this type of diagram. Sorry, I just want to try and get this up again. So this is what we call the pathway to targeted or intended violence. And essentially, if you look at the little red splotch at the top right-hand side, that's the attack. You can call it the attack. You can call it the adverse event. It could be someone just screaming and shouting, etc. But right at the bottom, everything of this nature starts with someone being unhappy. Like we saw in the Primrose School case, this kid felt, possibly unjustifiably so, that the teachers were complaining to his parents. Then he gets into trouble. He's unhappy with the teachers. That's his grievance. It might not be at all realistic, but that's his grievance. And at some point, he must have considered that violence is a solution. And then he starts to plan this, how am I going to do this? I have to get my dad's gun. So he goes and takes the gun out. He previously took bullets to school, and then probing and breaching, usually in a school environment or where the person works in the environment, isn't necessarily a big phase because he knows the circumstances and the layout. And those are the steps that people typically walk down before they engage in some kind of targeted violent act. So what we want to have is a system where we're picking people up already down here. See if I can get this right. At the grievance phase. Because if we can pick up that somebody's unhappy about something, maybe we can solve that problem. And then we don't get him going down the further steps. Or maybe we can find solutions for this individual. So your program really that you develop, you don't want to be looking for this, because then you're basically reacting. You want to be trying to find any of this behavior that you normally see along this pathway. Because the minute we see it is the minute we can intervene and de-escalate. And again, I mean, this is just another way of looking at the same thing. If you look at the outer pink or purple ring at the end, you've got things like suicide. The person fails, he has substance abuse, he drops out of school, and on the right-hand side at the bottom, he's got a violent act. But everybody starts out with being okay. I wouldn't say good necessarily, but reasonably okay. Now, people, as per normal, get angry for things, they get hurt by things, they get sad. And some people kind of self-recover. Some people just get on with it and carry on feeling the way they're feeling. Some people go for some counseling or guidance from a peer or a professional or a teacher. But imagine if we had a system that we're kind of monitoring what's happening in the inner purple and the blue phase, picking up all the people who are struggling with issues, who are in some kind of distress. Now, again, 95% of these people in the blue ring aren't going to go out to the point where they start to scream and shout and do any of the adverse negative things. But imagine if we're picking up and intervening with everybody that is. We will catch the ones who were on that pathway to step into the yellow ring, the green ring, and the outer pink ring. And that's where your program needs to focus on, not picking up people who've punched someone. That's easy. You need to be picking up people way before the punch is even a consideration in their mind, or before it's a reality in their mind as an option to engage in. Okay. So what do we need to see happening? And this is now more about what do we actually need to do with it. So there has to be a system in place for identifying, assessing, managing behavior that monitors cases. Because you can have a kid who in his grade 6, 7 year behaves in a particular way, but only might act out in grades 8 or 9. So how can we pick him up in grade 6, monitor him, keep track, check in with him, and make sure that he's not going to walk further down that pathway? Because this can be a very long pathway or a long time that we need to work with individuals of this nature. So we're focused on early identification before it's actually a problem. That's the best scenario. So how do we create this sort of program? The first step is you need a group of people. Call it a multidisciplinary team, call it whatever you want. I really don't mind. And their job is really to try and detect, manage, and document the threat assessment process and direct it, receive concerns that people have raised about someone who might be displaying concerning behavior, then gather further information that allows us to accurately assess what we're dealing with, assess that risk, and then develop a strategy for the way forward of how we're going to prevent this possible bad outcome from happening. And typically that's by helping the person who is the origin of that particular problem behavior. Now, again, this doesn't mean that you have to hire extra people. This doesn't have to be an expensive process. You can really repurpose some of the people in your school who are willing to be on a team like this, give them a little bit of training, that might be the only expense, and have them a group of people that are working together. So you're not having to employ additional resources in your school. But if you might even have already a school counselor of this and that or the other, but if they're not working together as a team, then you don't actually have a solution to your problem. You know, if you just think, well, whenever we have a problematic kid, we send them off to the school counselor if you're lucky enough to have one, and problem's taken care of. We'll hear if there's a problem later on. You're setting yourself up for a very, very horrific failure, because what we found in our experience is that the information doesn't come back to you that things are not going well with a particular student. Other things we want to consider is that, do we set up a little system like this in our own school? Or maybe if we're like a government school, we can set up something like this in our district. Or if you're a private school, you obviously might geographically divide up your school branches and have one team of people like this that serves, you know, a wider community of schools. And again, we're talking about people from your existing disciplines, you know, teachers who are keen on getting involved in such a team, guidance counselors, you know, sports coaches, psychologists, if you're very fortunate enough to have them in your school, administrators, you know, professional threat assessors. I literally don't care if you include the school cleaner, if they are the kind of person who will be able to contribute positively to such a team from their just very good experience at dealing with people. Really doesn't matter. as long as they're willing and interested to work on a team that's about helping kids not do something. But not just kids, because we can also have problems with our teachers who would also be, caught up, hopefully, by the system if it's functioning effectively. Of course, you would want to have someone who's a designated leader. Then you want to set up your protocols and procedures, sort of very general ones and very case specific. So what are we going to do when a complaint comes to our attention? What's our internal playbook for responding to these situations? How often are we going to meet as a team? You don't necessarily want to meet every morning because that's going to become very labor intensive. Do we meet at least once every 2 weeks to discuss existing cases? Or do we always meet when we have a new case that comes in? What are you going to call your team? Are you going to call it a threat assessment team? What about calling it an assessment and care team or a behavioral intervention team? Give it a name that doesn't make it something scary and concerning that people don't want to contribute towards being part of, or that people don't want to come forward with information to. And this is very important to understand, because a lot of you might be thinking, but we have a disciplinary team. Why do we need this team? They can just do it. No. A disciplinary team is not the same as a behavioral assessment team or threat assessment team or care team. They serve completely different functions, and I'll get into that into a moment. Because also, if you combine the two, students won't know that if I bring something to the attention of someone, is it going to be treated as a disciplinary issue, or is it going to be treated as a care issue? So you don't want people not being sure that does the reporting mean one thing or the other thing. A disciplinary team is about investigating an incident that's happened to determine whether there's going to be punishment. That's a disciplinary team. Threat assessment or a care team is about helping people to not do something and monitoring them for as long as necessary. So the two cannot serve. I mean, this is just a pictorial example of what I'm saying here. You can have one behavior that generates 3 responses. So, for example, a kid slaps another kid in school. Well, that's probably going to be leading to a disciplinary inquiry. I don't have a problem with that. We can't have kids slapping kids in school. But it can also potentially lead to a criminal investigation if that kid goes to the police and reports an assault. But also what it should be having, if you're going to have the first 2, definitely, is a threat assessment or a care program. How do we keep people safe? How do we know that that kid isn't going to do this again to someone? Or if the disciplinary he's got a minor punishment from the disciplinary hearing, how do we know for the future that this kid isn't going to go down that same pathway? How do we make sure it doesn't happen? So the first 2, your disciplinary investigation and your criminal investigation, are about gathering information to prove whether an event happened. And if they haven't had evidence to show that it did happen, how are we going to punish that person? And then it ends. Whereas a threat assessment or a care team approach, that keeps on going. It might even go on as long as this kid is a potential problem for the school. So a threat assessment case actually never gets closed. It might go on ice for a period of time, but it never actually closes. All right. And this team's only going to be effective if, firstly, people know about it. People know what they are supposed to bring forward to this particular team. And of course, if that team conducts a thorough assessment of what's been reported to them and does background information gathering to understand the context of this person's behavior, it implements proactive and integrated case management. It monitors the situation and on an ongoing basis reassesses the situation to see if things are getting worse, but perhaps even more importantly, to see if things are getting better. We don't just want to know about bad, we want to know about good. And of course, is cognizant of laws, policies, standards that exist in that area, in that school, in that province, in the country, that whatever program you set up is consistent with those policies and laws. And it's also only going to be effective if the people who are part of this team have actually received some very basic training in understanding threats, how to assess them, and how to manage them. And I can promise you, being a teacher for 20 years or a psychologist for 20 years doesn't magically make you a threat assessment professional. Of course, you might get some people who are just naturally very good at it, but the mere fact that you're a teacher for 20 years or a psychologist doesn't mean you know how to understand and assess threatening behavior. And I can guarantee you, as a clinical psychologist, people assume because you understand human behavior, you know when someone's a danger. We're not trained as a standard to assess dangerousness and risk of offending behavior. I only learned to do that in the police when I had specific training geared towards that. So again, we often have this misconception, but my educational psychologist or my clinical psychologist working for our school would know if there's a problem. Don't assume that, because you could be very, very horribly wrong. Because clinical judgment, when a person uses their experience to make a decision as to whether or not there's a problem, is about 51% accurate according to the research. So you may as well flip a coin. It's no better than flipping a coin when an expert like a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a policeman or woman make a decision about risk and dangerousness. And of course, you ultimately want the support of your management. If you don't have their support, you're not going to have the okay to proceed. You're not going to have the support in terms of the decisions that you might need to make on how to manage your case, which sometimes might seem counterproductive. So to say to someone, we don't actually want to have a disciplinary hearing, we don't want to have a criminal case, often sounds contrary to what is actually expected. But sometimes that actually is a very good decision if you're thinking purely in terms of keeping people safe. Of course, you want a case manager. Some of you might recall in Virginia Tech in the United States, quite a number of years ago, one of the students at the university went, and up until a few years later, was the biggest mass shooting in the United States. This young guy went to the Virginia Tech where he was a student with a bunch of guns and killed a number of students and injured a lot more. He had been on the radar of the university because the students had complained about his behavior in class. The lecturer had complained about his behavior in class. Students at the res, female students, had complained about his behavior, and that had been reported to the campus police. He had been come to the attention of the mental health unit of the university because he had suicidal behavior. But everybody thought the problem was being dealt with. When they sent him off for counseling, they thought, great, that's it, the problem is solved, and they'll let us know if it isn't. Well, he went twice and didn't go back again. And the university mental health people didn't know that he had been caught at the female reses harassing students. And the other people didn't know what was going on in the classroom. So you have a false sense of security if you don't have a system that integrates with each other and has someone who takes that responsibility for checking with the counselor. Has he been coming to his appointments? How is it going? You don't have to tell me the details, but is it getting better or is it getting worse? And who does that counselor call when suddenly in that session he says, I'm going to come to school tomorrow and kill someone? So you have to have a case manager who's keeping tabs with the teacher of this guy, the counselor of this particular person, the parents of this particular individual, maybe friends of this individual, to monitor and see that everything is actually working and going in accordance with the plan that's being developed. So again, you'd see something like this in terms of the manager's role. You'd have case manager in the middle. You might have student services, staff, family, admin, giving information, police and security, external experts, the legal department, possibly even HR, other students, etc., all playing a role in helping this case manager decide what's going on. Okay, but in terms of your school counselors, if you're very fortunate enough to have them, they might be the ones who are seeing the future violent actor, a violent offender. And really, they need to know who they have to plug into when there's a concern. And of course, if there's a concern for safety, psychologists and counselors are allowed to break confidentiality. And who do I need to go to? Because you don't want it to end up going to the wrong person who doesn't understand the big context. I said, you might be seeing the victims. You might be seeing 2 or 3 kids who are the victims of this person who's engaging in harmful behavior towards others, which is not yet lethal. But we might need to just, whisper in the ears of the threat assessment team to start looking into this particular issue. So definitely your counselors are going to be part of the management of this person and the monitoring, but you might even be the person who's in a way, you could say, the first report of the problematic behavior. Of course, then do you have experts, expert threat assessors? So yes, you can maybe train one of your people up in your school to be at the level of a what we would call a threat assessor, or you might want to have someone externally that you can consult, maybe when the case is a bit more complicated than what you're typically used to. And these would be people who've had proper training or using proper guidelines to assess the concerning behavior and can advise you on the level of concern and, of course, how are we going to deal with this. And that is something that does require additional skills and training beyond the maybe half-day training that the multidisciplinary team might get. Okay. And then, of course, we've got, how do we define what it is that we want to look at? You don't want to have this team looking at every kind of behavior that's not within the norm, so to speak. Because you'll get kids who are disruptive in class. They're not threatening, they're not harming, but they're the kind of kid who always cracks jokes and that disrupts the classroom, who's always talking. That's stuff that teachers can manage on their own. But concerning behaviors are those that actually require a bit of a closer look at, a little bit of a scratch around and see what's happening. Doesn't have to be 5-week long investigation. It can literally be a few right questions being asked from the right people for us to see if we have a warranted concern. Okay, so we want to look at not only threatening or fearful behavior, but anything that's a concern for another person's well-being. So, are we picking up there's a decline in performance? Are we picking up a decrease in or an increase in absenteeism amongst a particular student? Is he withdrawing or isolating? Are there dramatic changes in the person's behavior or appearance, or concerns about drug or alcohol use, or erratic or depressive emotional symptoms? Is the person mad, bad, or sad? Those types of things would warrant just a bit of a closer look. And remember, you're not doing that to get the person in trouble. You're doing that to see if they actually need some assistance. So concerning behaviors, as examples, this is not an exhaustive list. Does the person have racist or fixated thoughts such as hate speech, bullying behavior, displaying a weapon or threatening around a weapon? Does he directly communicate a threat to a teacher or student? Do they engage in self-harm behavior? Do they engage in physically assaultive behavior that's beyond what we might be expecting kids on the playground to be doing? Slamming doors, throwing things around, creating conversations that are designed to upset other students or cause fear. Or, of course, very severe mental health concerning behavior or language that depersonalize teachers or students. Okay. Other things, kids who storm out the classroom when upset, this prolonged non-verbal passive-aggressive behavior, arrogant or rude communication to teachers, shouting or screaming at students or teachers, being under the influence, displaying obscene or inappropriate artwork during the art classes, someone exposing themselves during the classes, and of course, medical-related types of emergencies. But one of the biggest challenges we see is, how do we hear about this information? Jumping back to the Primrose case, people knew that he had in a WhatsApp group he was going to do this. He brought bullets to school before, but how do we make sure that this stuff comes to our attention? And why don't people report certain concerning behavior? And I'm going to show you again, it's about a 1.5 minute long video. You can find these all on YouTube. If you go to Sandy Hook Promise, so Sandy Hook was where a shooting took place a number of years ago. I think it was a primary school. And from there, an NGO was created that sets out these sort of educational, provoking types of videos to make people think differently about these types of behaviors. So this is about 1.5 minutes, I think, that we can watch. Sorry, I'm just trying to get rid of my, get rid of it. Oh, sorry.
I'm here at the scene of tomorrow's shooting, where a 15-year-old will kill 4 children, 2 adults, and then turn the gun on himself. When the shooting starts happening tomorrow, first I'll probably just think it's firecrackers or a car backfiring or something. He told some of us that his dad kept a gun in his closet, and he always talked about using it on, the people that bullied him. Tomorrow I'll probably say that I wish I told someone.
After the shooting, we're going to feel pretty bad about picking on him, but until then, we'll probably just keep doing it because he's pretty weird.
Tomorrow I'll probably point out that something has seemed off with him since the beginning of the school year. And I'm now joined by the officers who will be the first responders tomorrow. What additional details can you share with us?
Well, someone is expected to tell us after the shooting that the shooter has been posting on social media about doing this for weeks.
So how will you explain the shooting to your daughter? Actually, I won't get to explain it to her because she won't make it. This is Christine Lynn, reporting from the scene of another shooting. We'll say we never saw coming.
Okay, so again, just re-emphasizing that what we saw today or recently in Primrose and we saw at the Krugersdorp shooting in 2000 or sword attack in 2008 is nothing new in the world of this type of behavior. And what we typically see people say as to when you ask them, why didn't you do something? Well, I didn't know I had to report this kind of behavior. I didn't know who to report to. I didn't want to get him or her into trouble. I was afraid that he would do something to me if he reported. I wasn't sure if it would remain confidential. Oh, but everybody does that. I didn't think he was serious. I didn't think he would do it now. I'm not a snitch. Well, he hasn't done anything yet. He was just threatening. It was a private thing. He was a boyfriend. And what we really don't want is for a primary school or high school kid to be making the decision as to what is necessary to bring forward. We really want to tell them everything that they should be bringing to our attention, because we want to just see if there's anything to it or not. So how do you typically hear about concerns? Well, students can raise concerns in various ways. They make threats, they make concerning statements in person, online, text messages. They engage in risky behavior. They submit assignments that might have wording that raises concerns. A fellow student might come forward and say what they heard or overheard. Or the person who receives the threat may then come forward and bring it to the attention of a teacher or whoever it might be, or parents notice some concerning behavior. So really what you want to do is you want an early warning system. You want that left of bang information, not a crisis response after the incident has taken place. And again, you want to identify these signs and symptoms long before it becomes problematic behavior. You want the reporting threshold to be low. You want people to be, again, in those first two little concentric circles that we showed you earlier, which I think is coming up again. We want to be hearing about things when they are there, not when they're in the fourth or fifth layer of the circle. And if people need help, why do you want to wait? So again, coming back to this, we want to know about things here, because it's much easier to help someone when they're just hurt, sad, or angry. Maybe the problem's a small problem. Maybe we can intervene that they get the necessary attention and assistance. But if you want to try and do that over here, 10 times more difficult. And like I said, you'll catch the ones who are potentially might be going to the point where we don't want them to. So it's not about punishing the person. I mean, that's the other thing. Again, if you end up with a team that's more like a disciplinary thing, tell us when people have done something bad, we'll investigate it, and we will take steps against them. Here, we're not taking steps against people. We're taking steps for people. That's why it's report to support, not report to punish. It's not about infringing on people's rights or spying on them, because again, this is about helping people to function effectively in the school environment, whether it's a student or a teacher. It's not about creating this big brother environment, because our goal is to help that individual, because by helping him or her, we prevent the violence from taking place. And that's a win-win for both sides. That person who was having the problematic issue and any potential victims who could be the recipients of the harmful behavior. But if you end up with something like this, you haven't ended up with a care team, threat assessment team, prevention team, whatever term you want to use. And that's again why you can't mix this up with your disciplinary team, because they have different purposes and goals. So it is about creating that safe and working and learning environment for teachers and students. That's helping people get the help they need, which is the most long-term solution to reducing people's risk of violence or harmful behavior. Like I said, it's helping the threatener not to do something that's going to get them into trouble. Who can complain about that? It's allowing your school to flourish, because if you have this kind of a system in place, you'll be helping everybody who needs help, not just the ones who might one day walk down the pathway to committing a violent act. It's also about being fair, because if you don't have some kind of assessment system, you might overreact when someone makes a comment like, I could just shoot someone at school. You might overreact by just, expelling the kid because of your zero tolerance policy. And sometimes, like I said earlier, adolescents say things that don't necessarily have the meaning or intention behind them. But we need to know that. And we're only going to know that by doing some kind of exploratory assessment of the situation. So we don't want people being unfairly targeted by, when something comes forward, because that itself creates its own problems. And it's also about being creative in your approach and response to each incident. Your response to how you're going to manage a particular incident is unique to that incident. So you might find 3 months down the line, another student does something of a similar nature, but your response is going to be completely different, because it's a different human being that has different needs, weaknesses, vulnerabilities compared to the other person 3 months ago. So you have to have you can't have stock standard approaches when it comes to preventing targeted violence. And of course, it's about being interactive with your school and your community. Like we always want to repeat over and over, it's from report to support. So how do we improve this fact that people don't come forward? Well, of course, you want to make it easier as possible for people to come forward as early as possible. We need to have students, employees, parents understand that this is about helping someone to be safe and helping someone not do something that could get them in a lot of trouble later. So like I said before, reporting should not equal a punishment outcome for this person. And that's again coming back to that zero tolerance approach. We need to tell people what they must bring forward. So it sounds stupid to have to say to students, if someone's threatening to kill someone, you need to tell us. We all think a student would come forward and tell us something of that nature, but they don't. And our examples at Primrose and at the Nick Deirdrick School in Krugersdorp show us that kids don't come forward. We don't want that kid to be the threat assessor. They don't have the skills and understanding to make a decision as to what is a threat and what isn't, what is a danger, what isn't. We don't want them to have that responsibility. So we need to tell people that whenever somebody says something like this, we need to hear about it so we can just make sure that actually there's no intention behind it. They need to know very clearly to whom it must be reported. Because what the last thing you want is a kid to come forward and say, my colleague here at Primrose said he's going to shoot people. And he tells that to a sports coach who says, oh man, that kid is just showing off. I know him, ignore it. We need to be very clear, not just report to a teacher, report to a specific teacher or teachers, this kind of behavior. Okay, and of course, we need to explain to people what's going to happen, that this isn't about punishment. If the kids still think that coming forward will lead to the person getting into trouble, they're not going to come forward. It's as simple as that. So they have to know what this is about. And what can I expect if I bring something to the attention of this team? Can I expect confidentiality? Can I expect feedback? Is somebody going to get into trouble? And then we also know that if it turns out that there is no concern of harm behind that threat that was made, there need to know that that's actually okay. That's actually great. We don't want there to be a threat. So if you come forward saying, Johnny said he's going to shoot someone, and we do our inquiry, and it turns out that actually, no, we don't have to worry about Johnny. He made a very inappropriate joke, and we're dealing with him and helping him make not inappropriate jokes in the future. That the person who came forward should be not rewarded, but thanked for coming forward. And so, you know what, it's okay. We're lucky, nothing happened, but we really appreciate that you came forward. This is showing us that the system is working. And again, kids don't think like adults. So we cannot expect them to make the kinds of decisions that we make. Again, so you want to have a policy. Now, a policy document is the written stuff that everybody's going to read on how we deal with these kind of problems in our school. So a code of ethics or code of conduct or a code of sexual harassment or a bullying policy isn't what we're talking about here. Because if you go and think about the policies you have in your school that touches on those topics, it's probably a list of what you mustn't do and how much trouble you'll be in when you do it. Most people probably know that they shouldn't be doing those behaviors, and telling people that you're going to be in trouble if you do it is not a deterrence prevention strategy for this kind of behavior occurring. So they're not the kind of policy that we're referring to when we say a policy that's aimed at helping us pick up and identify and manage concerning behavior. They tend to be more, don't do this or you'll be punished if you do. So that policy, like I said, is a written document. It sets out what behavior is okay and what isn't. Not necessarily listing hundreds of behaviors, but what kinds of behaviors. It also sets out what are we going to do and who you're going to go to when there's a concern that comes up of this nature. And ideally, it shouldn't be a policy that the teachers put together and then is imposed upon the school. Because you want staff, students, and parents to be role players in the development. You want to say, we want to set up a system or a method or a policy where we can help people before they do something like that shooting at Primrose School. What do you think are the kinds of behaviors we should be concerned about? How do you think the reporting should work? Because if the kids are part of it, they're going to definitely understand the policy, and they're going to be more likely to contribute to it. And they're just as much a part of this process as teachers would be, as parents would be, etc. So there needs to be a buy-in. That buy-in is also helping them understand what it's about at the same time. It needs to be evidence-based. We need to understand what kind of issues we're dealing with. So literally, like I said in the beginning, take the list of types of behaviors to your classroom tomorrow and say, have you guys ever experienced this? Raise your hand. How about this? Raise your hand. And you'll see the kind of things that are actually happening in your school. So that's what I mean by evidence-based. But also evidence-based means that the decisions you make and how you make those decisions, how you assess the concern, should be based on previous experiences of people that have dealt with this. research that's out there, training manuals about this, not just a thumb suck based on what you think should be done, as to how to assess. And of course, what are we going to call this? Like I said, some people call it a care team. Some people call it a behavioral management team or a behavioral intervention team. Doesn't really matter. But again, come up with a name with the people, with the students, with your staff, as to what this should be called. I'm just conscious of time, and I might have to skip through fast things. Again, how are we going to report? Could it be face-to-face? Could it be a dedicated email? Could it be online? Could it be a WhatsApp number? The more options you have for people to come forward, the more likely people will come forward. We want to promote safe school climates. We want to build a culture where people are respectful, trustful, supportive, where we intervene when there's problematic behavior, that students feel connected. Because you find that the students that do these kind of very extreme types of things often don't feel invested in the school. They don't feel connected to the school, the teachers, etc. They don't participate in sports and clubs very often, etc. And this is really what we're aiming for. So step 4, when do we get law enforcement involved? Now, involving law enforcement doesn't mean we're opening up a criminal case. But you might have, when you start this whole team, ask your local police station, is there somebody who's interested in just being part of this team? Or that we can be a contact point when we have to ask questions of the police. So again, it's not bringing them in because we want to get people into trouble legally, but there might just be an important role player in helping you in the future, or information about someone, etc. Right? And the establishment procedures, again, who's going to be doing what in this team that you've put together of people? What's the response going to be when a complaint comes in? And we always say that you can't connect the dots if you don't collect the dots. So if you've only got information about the little blue dots that you see here, you're not going to be able to formulate an accurate opinion about what's the current concern, what do we fear this person might do, how worried should we be. But once you've collected all the dots, you can start to literally fill in the blanks. So that the team that you put together needs to have clearly defined processes. How are we as a team going to respond when we get a complaint or a concern brought to our attention? What's a standard procedure that you're all on the same page that allow us to form an accurate picture of what's going on? So, of course, that could be anything from doing interviews with the problematic person, other people who are the recipients of the concerning behavior, online social media pages, speaking to the teachers of that particular student, saying, how's it going in class over the past few months? What's his academic performance like? Is there a disciplinary history that we should know about that could help us understand this kind of behavior? So if someone has been in trouble 5 times for slapping someone in the face, and today he's threatening to slap someone in the face, well, that previous behavior is going to be a pretty good indicator of what we can realistically expect from this person. And again, informs us how we're going to intervene. So again, we want to gather information that's going to help us understand what we're dealing with and how to prevent it. And I'm going to rush through some themes in a moment as to what kind of things are we going to look for when we conduct our assessment. How is this person's home circumstances? Do they have physical health issues? Do they have a history of problematic behavior? Do we have indications of psychological issues, formal or informally, with this particular individual? We always say that everybody has a limited amount of psychological strength. If you've got too many things that are sapping that strength away, you're not going to cope. But maybe we can reduce some of those psychological stresses so there's more energy to deal with what's left over. We're going to look at motives. And again, I'm not going to read through every detail on the slides. There are slides. The slides were posted in the chat. What are this person's motives? Are there other concerning communication? So he might have threatened you, but now we do an inquiry and we find out that actually he's been threatening other people. He's been talking about this on social media. You need to collect those dots. Have other people noticed concerning behaviors, statements, substance issue concerns, behavioral changes in general, academic performance? Does he have inappropriate interests? Does he have strong interests in mass violence, school shooters, suicide, a preoccupation with a death? His Google searches regularly how to make a bomb. We see this in his YouTube searches, the movies he watches, etc. Does he have access to a weapon? So if someone's threatening to shoot someone, we definitely want to phone the parents and say, do you own a firearm? Because we've had threats, and maybe we need to temporarily make sure that firearm isn't on the premises. It's temporarily handed into the police for safekeeping, or it's at a firearm shop for storage, etc. But again, don't just get focused on the firearm. Anything can be used as a weapon. You know, what kind of stresses are going on in this person's life inside school and outside of school? Emotional and developmental issues. Does this person express that violence is an acceptable option? You know, does he tag posts where someone behaved violently towards a person because they were rude? And if he's saying this is the way to go, this is how you deal with problems, well, we know that this is part of at least of his psychological problem-solving behavior. You know, do they have the capacity to carry out violence? You know, if this kid is, you know, a Springbok karate or judo person, well, if that person does get violence, he has additional skills to engage in it. Or is he engaged in violent behavior, but previously, again, shows us that he has the capacity. Again, is there some kind of planning if we start to speak to friends and family, if we have access to emails and other things that we legally have access to? You know, does he been drawing maps of the school where the cameras are, where the security guard is, where there's a hole in the fence? You know, but what positive things are there? What positive issues are in this person's life? Does he have a very strong relationship with one particular teacher? That's great. Does he have one or two really good friends who are positive friends? We don't want him being friends with the drug dealers in school and the kids who are always in trouble. You know, is there a positive, trusting relationship with an adult in or outside the school, which we can build upon? Is he connected in other ways, in pro-social ways? Maybe he's part of a soccer team that he really, really likes. Those are all positive, protected factors. And in terms of how this process goes, a report comes to your attention, it gets to the threat assessment team. They gather information from the various sources, you know, that are out there that we legally have access to. It could be school information sources, could be outside of school. Then the threat assessment is conducted. Then we want to look at if there's a low risk, that's absolutely fantastic. Then we just want to monitor it maybe. Maybe once a week we check in with that person. But if there's a high risk, then we definitely want to decide how we're going to manage this high risk. How are we going to bring this person's risk down actively? And by very, very creative means. Okay, and what are those strategies? So again, we want to look at what are the risk factors in this person's life. Has he got stressors? Has he got substance problems? Does he have relationship problems, financial problems? Can we deal with any of those? Because that again frees up that psychological energy. And then we have to also start to think, but what do we think this person might do? Sometimes it's very clear because they've told us, or they've told someone in an essay, I'm going to come to school and shoot people. We have to think beyond that. Are there other possible scenarios of what we think this kid could do? To whom, when, where? How dangerous would it be, or how severe? How often would this behavior happen? How long before it happens, or how imminent is it? Or how long would that bad behavior go on for? And once you start to think in terms of scenarios, it also makes it much easier to plan for preventing that scenario from realizing. Then, like I said, how often do we review this case? A low concern, we might review as a stock standard once every 2 weeks or once a week, unless something happens. But a more concerning case, we want to monitor more frequently. And like we said, because people can fluctuate in terms of their risk, because of their psychological state of mind, substances, stressors, etc., we might find that 6 months down the line, this person becomes a problem again. So again, those monitoring mechanisms, which could be just checking in with family, checking in with friends, school friends, checking in with his class teachers. Maybe there's a mentor that was assigned to him. How do we check in with that? Even following on Twitter or public social media forums to see, is this person posting positive things? Or is this person tagging violent acts committed by other people? Even the bus driver, if he catches a school bus to school, can comment on, yeah, he's been very chatty, he's laughing, joking, anything that tells us, is this person doing okay? And of course, high-risk cases might be assessed far more frequently than your low-risk, low-level cases. So what are the benefits of this program? Well, firstly, staff and students alike would feel safer. In general, because you're catching people in that first 2 bubbles, you're improving the mental health and physical health and well-being of students and staff. You're more likely to retain staff and students, specifically staff, if they think that their safety is being taken seriously. It's a very good public relations exercise, because you can say, we have a threat assessment system set up in place to keep our schools safe. Because when parents nowadays are looking for schools, that might be a question. How do you know that you won't have what happened at Primrose? Well, sir, because we have a threat assessment care team, and this is how we work. Reduces absenteeism among scholars and staff, avoids a negative work environment. And of course, if there's one thing that's going to cost you a lot of money as a school, it's a violent incident, because you will have people suing the school, survivors, surviving victims, their families, if this was something that could be prevented because people knew about it. The Virginia Tech shooting all those years ago, I think at that time cost $450 million for that university, from lawsuits, fixing the damages, implementing new systems in place. So if people say to you, well, we can't afford this training, I can promise you, if you have an incident like this, it's going to cost you a lot more than any money you spent on just trying to set up a system. And of course, the ultimate thing is not only does it keep people safe, but it prevents the loss of life. So you need to be thinking about this now, because this problematic behavior is already occurring in your school to some degree. You need to have that policy in place, which tells people what we expect of them, the policy that you developed in conjunction with the staff and students and parents. You need to train your managers and faculty on what they need to bring to our attention if they see something. You can't just rely on students. Teachers notice things. You have to have that core team of people who are all on the same page as to how are we going to approach this bad behavior? How are we going to assess this bad behavior? You need to make people aware of what they must bring to your attention. You need to intervene when something is brought to your attention. And of course, ideally survey what's taking place. This is all doable. And like I said, doesn't cost millions and millions of rands or thousands of rands for schools to set up. All right, I see we are literally on 4 minutes left over. So again, if you're interested in, again, the stuff we've been talking about fits squarely within the mandate of the African Association of Threat Assessment Professionals in terms of our conference themes, the type of things that we want to focus on. So please go there. There's the website address at the top. If you're interested in your organization, perhaps joining the organization or checking every now and then for the webinars that we have upcoming. Again, wonderful. We also have, if you are a member, you'd have access to a whole library of these types of pre-recorded or recorded events are accessible to people who are members of the association.